All right, so today we're going to talk about the again, Chapter 13, some of the topics in the economics of crime and punishment. And last time I put some places where you might look up data on and discussed them a little bit. There was the Uniform Crime Report in the website for the FBI.gov, their website, and we put that up. I also found another one. It's called the Crime Data Explorer, and this is the website for that, and it has additional data. In fact, it has quite a bit of data. So again, if you're looking for a paper topic, again, the paper will. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll have the paper due 2 days after the final, and I will be sending out I sent you an email, but I'll be sending out the final, and we'll be doing the final as a take-home final this time. And so anyway, you might want to just take a look at some of these sources. I talked about the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. So again, you can probably find more sources of data if you just get on the website, go to Google or whatever you want to use. But those are some sources. And I also put as I mentioned, a 2018 Congressional Research Survey, Congressional Research Service study on violent crime, and that's in the 472 folder in the section on criminal. Just a couple of observations from this. There's a September 2020 bulletin of criminal victimization for 2019. And it's interesting that the victimization of violent crime has declined, at least it had declined, from 2018 to 2019. And again, this is from the Bulletin of Criminal Victimization, which is the September 2020, and that is they fell 12% from 2018 to 2019. And if you look at the data farther out, if you look from 1993 to 2019, it fell by 75%. So there's been a substantial reduction in the rate of victimization for violent crime. This is excluding simple assault. Just another couple points. Again, you can look through the data, anything that you're interested in. But men commit 7 times more murders than women. Sort of interesting. They commit 7 times more murders than women, but they're also victims of crime more. That men are 4/5 about of murder victims. So violent crime definitely tends to be a male thing. And again, when you're looking at how rational are crimes, it may be something that murders have less rational view than do stealing cars, right? So again, many times we've talked about this, but this is to give you some guidance and some some thinking about why would this be, right? Is there something different in the male persona, but why would they be the victims of murder more? There's men against men in terms of murder, so it's just sort of an interesting thing just to think through. All right, so let's now talk about the next section. Is does punishment actually deter crime? Does punishment deter crime? And of course, remember that we're talking about if you're a rational criminal, what are you doing? You're trying to maximize the difference between what the gain to you from crime is and what the costs are you. Remember that we said, we had y of x is equal to p of x times f of x, where y of x is the return from the severity of the crime or the number of crimes. And then if the probability of being caught depends on the severity of the crime, we've talked about this several times, the expected losses, or the expected loss from a crime, you're trying to maximize that difference, right? You're maximizing this difference. The cost to you, or expected cost to you of a crime, if you're a criminal, is the probability of being caught times the punishment that you get. And we said that the punishment might vary with the number of crimes, or it might vary with the severity of the crimes. So the question is, does this part really deter crime? If we were thinking about it, yes, if you were looking at it from a rational criminal perspective, you'd expect that to be the case. But there's lots of things to think about, right? Just sort of, it makes a logical sense if we're thinking about rational criminals. But so let's just think about some sort of questions about this. And the first question that we might think about is, do criminals have a psychological condition that affects their ability to determine what this is, right? Do criminals have a psychological condition that affects their ability to judge these two things? That is there something about this type of personality, or we're saying that criminals, rather than just being some sort of rational actor, like when you go to the grocery store and you're figuring out what to buy, or whether you're deciding, do you want to work for another hour and look at the marginal benefit to you of the wage and compare it to the opportunity cost of your time. If that's if you had a perfectly rational criminal, this would disrupt this theory, right? If there was some psychological condition that says criminals have this something in their psychology that makes it so that they underestimate this. If they somehow underestimate the probability of being caught, or they underestimate what the true cost of being in prison is, then you would have you'd have to change your view a little bit on the rationality, this sort of rational criminal behavior. Now, a second thing is perhaps do drugs and alcohol affect this ability to judge? What these things are, right? If you are an alcoholic, well, you tend to engage in criminal activity more than is the rational criminal would expect, because you are, again, underestimating this. So do we find that people who are committing crimes, do they tend to be people who, if they are on drugs at the time, or were they drunk at the time? Did they engage in an assault on somebody because they were drunk? Okay, so that may, being drunk may affect these things. You don't allow people to drive drunk, right? And so that may be a sign that this is a problem, right? If you think that people are more likely to engage in criminal activity, then maybe what you ought to do is to have things which make it so that you can't be drunk in public, right? And we have laws that say you can't be drunk in public. Well, why would you do that, right? If you thought that this was a problem, then that sort of law would make some sense. Another thing is, do different groups have different discount rates? Do they have different discount rates, and why would that matter? Okay, if young people have a higher discount rate than older people, then it may be that lengthy prison terms are not as effective with younger people than older people, and so maybe what you ought to do is increase the probability of being caught rather than lengthening the prison term. So if there, it seems sort of a more obvious dichotomy is between young and old, but if for some reason you could think of a group that had a higher discount rate than another group, then what you might want to do is when you are deciding how to allocate your resources towards criminal deterrence, maybe you'd put more of your resources into P of X than you would into F of X. And then, do they know the true value, right? We talked about maybe they'd have fixed their some psychological condition that affects their ability to judge this. Do they know what the true value is? Of y of x, but primarily f of x and p of x. That is, when we're looking at someone that is thinking about robbing a grocery store or is thinking about pickpocketing someone, did they really know what the sentencing might be if they were caught? Do they really know what the probability of their being caught is? And that is something that, again, it's a reasonable question to ask. Perhaps this whole theory is out there, but what's going on is criminals really don't know what the law is. And again, in which case we talked about, do you want to put on the signs on the freeway that say, you can be fined by $1,000 or whatever for every 10 miles you're over the speed limit or something like that. And sometimes you've seen that on the freeways where they're trying to alert you as to what the possible f of x is, or they may say, that there are some way of knowing how fast you're going. We have some mechanism of determining how fast your actual car is going or something like that. And so we may have a public policy to increase the people's, the rational criminals' knowledge of what these are. You might even want to make it so that this P of X is perceived by the criminal to actually be larger than it is, right? You could do things which would advertise that we're going to get you, right? You will be caught if you do this, to try to influence the criminal's perception of what P of X is. Another thing that we've talked about is the opportunity costs of criminals. Right? We said that if you're deciding whether to, let's say you were deciding whether to pickpocket someone, and you were an attorney and you were making $300 an hour, you're probably not going to pickpocket someone, right? Because your opportunity cost, if you were actually caught, would be very high, right? If you couldn't do anything else with your time, if you, let's say, had been convicted 3 times of crimes and it was unlikely that anybody was going to hire you, then what are you going to do? It may be that you will engage in criminal activity. You will, join a gang, or you will do something like that because you don't have very much other ways that you can earn a living. And so the opportunity cost of criminals we've talked about. And then, so you might want to have public policy that made it so that you have some sort of mechanism where you make it a policy to attempt to hire people that have committed crimes, but let's say they haven't committed a crime for 2 years or something like that. Then you'd have some sort of public policy where you try to hire such people. And then lastly, we've sort of been talking about it, is there really, does crime pay? That is y of x, is that bigger than 0? Is there and clearly for some crimes it is, right? But maybe for other crimes it isn't. And if there really is no payoff to crime, then if it doesn't really pay off, then this theory that we're talking about, maybe it applies only to certain types of crime. Clearly, it did for the mafia, right? When we were looking at prohibition. And clearly it does for drug cartels, right? It clearly pays for those sorts of things. So again, for things which this theory of the rational criminal is more likely to apply in cases where it's clear that there's a positive payoff. Now, just a sort of a larger observation is that what if we went out to try to test whether this happens, right? How do you statistically test a theory? Okay, and so some of you have had econometrics, right? And if you've had econometrics, or even if you hadn't, perhaps in you did some regression analysis in your stats class, there's lots of things to sort of think about, right? One of the things is left out variables. That is, if we're trying to estimate the number of crimes, let's say, how does an econometric model work, right? You estimate this model where you have y is equal to some a x1 plus b x2 plus c x3 plus some sort of error term, right? You go on, put x's in there. And so what do? You get observations on the dependent variable. In this case, it might be the amount of crime. And then you might have what the unemployment rate is. You might have the amount of what the amount of a fine might be, what the amount of what's the incarceration rate, what's the conviction rate. You might put in all sorts of variables here, right? Well, if you leave out some variable, then that is going to show up in the error term, and that will bias what these coefficients are. So the point to make is that if you've left out variables when you go to do an econometric test to see if your theory is correct, then this econometric test might give you the wrong answer if there are variables that are left out that are important, right? That somehow there's something outside outside what your independent variables are, and you've forgotten that one. It's going to show up in the error term, and that's going to bias what these results are. And you may get the idea that this coefficient is really not greater than 0 statistically, but it would be if you'd have put the right the right variables in here, it would make this thing turn statistically positive. Second thing is the functional form. That is, what if you've estimated this as additive, but in fact, the true relationship is y is equal to a x1 times b x2 times c times x3 times some sort of error. All right? So maybe this thing is multiplicative rather than additive, and what you did is you estimated it as if it was this, and you may get the wrong numbers for A, B, and C if you've put the wrong functional form. And then just a third thing to think about is you might have all sorts of data on people that got caught, but what do you do about what if people didn't get caught, right? We don't really have observations on who committed the crime if nobody got caught, right? So just another sort of econometric piece is just thinking about observations on criminals who are not caught, right? Those are not going to be included in your database. So the point just being that if you look at an econometric test of does crime pay in some sense, or does punishment deter the crime? If I'm going to try to look at does punishment deter the crime, and because we've got this theory about it, and then I do this econometric analysis to try to test that theory. Here's, again, if you've had any econometrics, these are common problems to any econometric model. And again, if you were trying to say, it's better to increase the probability of being caught than it is to increase the length of sentencing. If you're trying to really address that, it might not be possible to do it through some econometric modeling. You might have to just sort of think through it and say, it's pretty obvious that for this group of people, increasing the probability of being caught is likely to be more efficient than is the increasing the fine or increasing the length of incarceration. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about what is the efficient punishment. We could have, for example, you could imprison people or you could fine people, etc. So let's think a little bit about, we labeled that as 3, efficient. If we want to have efficient punishment. Okay, so now we're looking at the punishment side of things. And so the first thing that we could, broadly you can do lots of things, but broadly we're going to talk about whether we have incarceration or whether we have fines or whether we have some sort of social program. So let's start out with incarceration. Right? Should you throw people in prison or should you throw them in jail? First of all, we could look, what are you going to do? You're looking at the social benefit of incarceration and the social costs of incarceration, right? Again, we're trying to do things as long as the marginal benefit is bigger than the marginal cost. So these are just things to think through. What are the benefits? And some of them might not be very measurable, but you might be able to have an intuition that these things might be important or these other things might not be as important. So the first one is deterrence, right? That is, actually there's an E here. Again, when you're doing phonics, it's sometimes you can't really tell whether it's an A or an E. But anyway, deterrence, that is what's the social benefit of putting people in jail is the first thing, as we've been talked about, is that is imprisonment more effective in deterring crime than fine or increasing the probability. You know, how effective is the f of x in deterring crime? Right? So, you know, again, we've been discussing this ability of imprisonment to deter crime. Is it better to increase f of x, or maybe we ought to focus on p of x? So if there's a large deterrence effect to increasing the, you know, of putting people in jail, if that really deters you from stealing things at the Walmart, we've talked about it probably doesn't, but because the probability of your being caught is so low. But nonetheless, if we know that putting people in jail is an effective deterrent, then that's a social benefit from incarceration, right? And there's probably certain, again, there may be certain groups of people in which it's effective, and there might be certain crimes for which incarceration is an effective means of deterring. Again, when you do an econometric analysis, it may be hard to figure out exactly what that might be, but we, again, might have some intuition given what the certain circumstances are. Second thing to talk about is, what about retribution? Right? And this is sort of a justice idea. That is, it's just to punish you in proportion to what the seriousness of the crime is, right? Let the punishment fit the crime sort of story, right? That is, there's some justice in having a serious punishment for a serious crime. So we might say, hey, we're not going to throw you in jail for pickpocketing. We're not going to throw you in jail for shoplifting at the Kroger's. But we might put you in jail for shooting somebody. Okay? Even aside from this idea that of the deterrence issue, is there some social justice benefit to putting people in jail for serious crimes? Is there some sort of moral improvement to society if we were to put people in jail or put people in prison for a serious crime? A third thing that we might talk about is rehabilitation. That is, can we do something with the incarceration that actually rehabilitates people? And I think I mentioned before, but in 1986, when I was on the Senate policy staff and John Engler was the majority leader in the Senate, I talked to him about the possibility of putting factories in prisons. That is, allowing like IKEA, which I don't think IKEA was around in those days, but allowing IKEA to open up a factory inside the prison and then hire the people. And I was presenting the idea that after, you know, you'd been there for 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and you'd been an employee of IKEA through that whole 5-year period, it would make it easier for you to get a job when you got on the outside. And then it turns out that Warren Berger, so this is, you know, Gary Wolfram, 1986 in Michigan proposal. And it turns out that Chief Justice Warren Berger had suggested it as well. And of course, he has a little more influence than a Senate Republican policy staff person. But nonetheless, the idea was very similar. That is, if you were to put incarcerate people and your prison system was such that during that incarceration period, it would improve the value of their marginal product. It would make it so that when they got out, then they would be able to have a job that earned more than their, what they would be earning if they were a criminal, if they had a high recidivism rate, et cetera. So that, again, an advantage of incarceration sort of depends on what you do within the prison, right? So Warren Berger, as I pointed out, had been suggesting in the mid-1980s about having companies in prison and hiring people, and that would, as I said, increase their value of their marginal product by increasing their human capital. A fourth thing that might be a social benefit from incarceration is that it incapacitizes people. That is the criminal, right? Incapacitation. Let's see how we spell that. Incapacitation. Incapacitation. Okay? Again, try to use phonics here. So we're going to incapacitate people, right? What does that mean? It means that they can't commit a crime while they're in prison, right? If you're, well, presumably, there's been, there's some observations that actually the drug lords, et cetera, are committing crimes while they're actually in prison. They're directing things from prison. But nonetheless, let's presume that what we're talking about is while you're in prison, you're not going to be able to commit a crime. So if that's the case, that you can't commit a crime during that period, well, that's a social benefit, right? But there's some things to think about. One is, right, it reduces the time a criminal has to commit crimes. But what if they're just replaced by new criminals? Right? What if other criminals just take their place? That is, we arrest a drug lord and we put that drug lord in prison for 10 years. Is what's going to happen is somebody just steps into that position, right? It's like we fire the chief executive officer of a company, and that person is then replaced by somebody else. Right? So what if other criminals just replace them? And so if that's the case, then the social benefit from incapacitation is going to be lower than if that really just sets them aside. So again, it would depend on what the criminal activity is, right? It may be that we're not going to have a new shoplifter replace that person, but if we're talking about a drug lord, then it might be that they, again, as we were just talking earlier about whether they would be able to carry on carry on their activity from within the prison. So the question is, would a new drug lord just come in and replace them? If that's the case, then incapacitation wouldn't have as positive a social benefit as if they weren't able to. Another thing to think about is it just might reduce the timing of crimes. All right. It might reduce the timing of the crime. That is, yeah, you're gone for 2 years, but what happen is then you just commit the crimes more quickly once you get out. That is, it doesn't really affect the number, right? It might just reduce the timing of crimes, not the number of them. That is, you might have, think about me, you might have committed 2 crimes a year, and then you're gone for 3 years instead. Then when you get out, you do 6 crimes a year, right? So there might be, again, there might be certain types of criminal activity that it may be effective in incapacitating the people in terms of increasing the social benefit of incarceration, but there might be situations where all you've done is you've changed the timing of the amount of, not the amount of crimes that are committed. Another observation is that if we're like that. Another observation is that what if youthful people commit more crimes than do older people? I mean, how often do you see that there was some 68-year-old that was arrested for assault, right? Or some 72-year-old that was arrested for murder, or even for robbing a grocery store, something like that. So if we have a situation where you have youthful offenders, then what you might do is you might make it so that they're off the street. What if this really works where we have a reduction in the time that the criminal has to commit crimes? What if when youthful offenders are off the street, then what happens is they don't commit the further crimes when they are older, right? So what if youthful offenders are off the street, but they don't commit crimes when they're older, okay? So that you will have a social benefit to incarceration. That is that I've got that I'm keeping these youthful folks off the street, but then they don't go out and commit further crimes because there's a less amount of crimes being committed by age group. All right. So again, those are some of the social benefits of incarceration. We talked about, we said deterrence, retribution from a moral perspective or a justice perspective. Could you rehabilitate people within the prison system? And do we really incapacitate people? That is, they don't have the ability to commit as many crimes over their lifetime. Now let's talk a little bit about the social costs of imprisonment. Or social costs of incarceration. Well, first of all, you have a direct cost, right? If we think about just how does it work? If you sort of think about it, I have to have a building, right? I've got to have right? I have to have a prison, or I have to have a jail. I have to have some place that we're going to house these prisoners. And these things are probably relatively expensive to build. And if they're going to be secure, you might have to spend more. You might have to spend more on a prison that it was very important that you keep people from escaping. Think about Alcatraz. I was, got my PhD at Berkeley, and Alcatraz was an island in the San Francisco Bay, and so you could see Alcatraz if you crossed from Oakland on the Oakland Bay Bridge. If you went from Oakland into San Francisco, you could see Alcatraz out there. So what was that? It was like this prison that was on an island. And so it might be expensive to build these things. Once you've got it there, you also have to maintain it, right? I have to keep the prisons up. I have to make sure that that the roof's not leaking. I have to make sure that the locks are working. All the sorts of things that you might think about as you're maintaining especially if you have a very large facility, there might be very high costs to maintaining that facility. I have to staff it. Right, if I use if I use incarceration as my method of deterrence, and what I got to do is think through, okay, how much am I going to pay for the prison guards, right? How many prison guards am I going to have? Who's going to provide the food for such things? And again, there's all sorts of direct costs that you can think about if you were in charge of Michigan's prison system. There's obviously somebody that is, and so what do they got to think about? They got to think about, okay, how are we going to pay for the day-to-day operation of this prison? Just one thing that's sort of important that people don't think about as much is, what about health care? Again, you can think of lots of things that are direct costs, but particularly if you think about the elderly, right? Do you want to keep somebody that's in prison that's 68 years old when their medical costs are going to be very high, right? And so it might be that you want to release people from prison after a certain age because the social cost of paying for their health care may be greater than the social benefits that might be from having them be incarcerated. Another thing to think about is that there may be a more productive use of their time, right? That is, rather than a social cost from having you in prison is, what else could you be doing with their time? Right? Could they be producing some good or service that society would benefit from? So there's maybe some more productive use of an inmate's time. And so that's the opportunity cost, right, that we'd be talking about. And again, we had already talked about this idea of having factories in the system as a mechanism to rehabilitate prisoners, right? But it also fits within this structure too, right? That is, rather than having them rather than having them just cleaning up the yard of the prison or something like that, they could actually be producing automobiles or something like that. Actually, just as an aside, again, I think I've mentioned that I fought fire for the state of California for 6 fire seasons. And when we were on fires, they had inmate hand crews that were from the California prisons. And they were inmates that were released in order to help us fight fires. Usually they were hand crews in the sense that they used hand tools to construct fire line. We didn't really use them on the fire trucks, but we did bring them in as hand crews. But anyway, I put the Warren Berger report, a report that discusses Warren Berger's idea. It's called Factories with Fences, and I did put that in the folder that is in your ECON 472 folder. I put it in the subfolder on the criminal incarceration subfolder that's in the Wolfram ECON 472 folder. Another thing is that you could also do things like, as an alternative, if you're talking about there's a more productive use of the inmate's time, you might have some mechanism where you put some sort of GPS system to track where they are. That is where the prisoners might be, or the inmates might be. So rather than having them having you be held in a prison or held in a jail, we have this GPS system that's hooked onto your leg or hooked on somewhere, and then so we can always follow where you are. So if you're going to work, we'd know this is where you were. You know, you were at your, you're teaching at Hillsdale College or something like that. We'd know whether you were going to the grocery store or what was going on. That may be a more effective in terms of a reduction in the social cost of incarceration. Now, a third thing that we might talk about is sentencing reform. Let's talk about sentencing reform. There's an interesting discussion about whether we should have sentencing reform. That is, there was a movement towards mandatory sentencing. As I've mentioned before, you have this 3 strikes and you're out in California. That is, after your 3rd felony, then you're you have this mandatory lengthy sentence. And of course, we've talked about, what would be a problem with that might be that the probability of being convicted might be altered by that. But it may be that judges should have more discretion on individual cases. Maybe the judge knows that for this particular case, that this sentence ought to be lower. They know the person, or there's some, or they have some knowledge about what the effects of imprisonment might be, or of putting in jail might be, and that this person would be better off doing something else, like a training program or something like that. So we would allow more discretion if you were said, okay, one of the public policy issues could be, should we have sentencing reform? Should we get rid of mandatory sentencing, for example? And again, that's a public policy issue that one might talk about. In fact, in 2015 in Michigan, the Michigan Supreme Court struck down mandatory sentencing. And so we no longer have mandatory sentencing in Michigan, and so that's the mandatory minimum sentencing, and so that allows the judge to have more discretion in saying, okay, in this particular instance, we'd be better off if we thought that the social cost to imprisonment or incarceration in this particular instance, if that social cost is greater than the social benefit, then what we ought to do is we ought to have maybe this GPS system or some other mechanism to or have where they have to go to drug rehabilitation or something like that. All right. Well, that will conclude today's lecture. So for Friday, what we'll do is continue through chapter 13, and we'll be talking about, we'll finish up this section and then talking about the death penalty, and then talking about drugs and crime. So you might want to just go ahead and work through perhaps just work through chapter 13, and then the amount of time that we have, we'll go back if we, once we get through chapter 13, as I said, we'll go back and look at the legal institutions, which skipped over to make sure that we got through the criminal activity.